Well, look, our next guest is the best and most honest foreign journalist in Moscow. There are other foreigners pretending to be journalists in Moscow, though they are quite often under cover. In any case, when they are not, they are lying, twisting propagandists for the countries, or the regimes rather, the governments of the countries from which they come. Chay Bowes is an Irishman, a European, a Westerner. Even the FT would have to agree that he's a Western journalist, but he's based in Moscow. And over the last period in particular, he has produced the best, the most visceral, bristling commentary of this bloody affair known as the NATO war on Russia. So, political commentator Chay Bowes joins us again tonight here on the mother of all talk shows. Chay, first of all, let me get a Russian perspective from your side. What did you pick up in Moscow about the scenes in Washington that happened this week? Laughter, joy, tears, disbelief, or all of them?
Well, George, you can imagine it's been a mixture of all three. I'm, reminded of the term. It's a German term. It's a beautiful word in the German language, schadenfreude, which essentially translates into, it's hard to describe it, but it translates into sort of, reveling in the sort of distress of an enemy. Now, there's less of that than you would have imagined in Moscow. I think the first response was abject shock. I mean, nobody expected this. After the toing and froing with Zelensky, he will sign, he won't sign, President Trump's dictator comments, or did I call him that? So people were sort of expecting a rapprochement between the two, that a PR exercise will be pushed over the line in order to get something from this deal, this minerals deal, which is a paper tiger in many ways. And interestingly, just prior to this meltdown in the Oval Office, Donald Trump had made a very interesting comment on Fox Radio. It wasn't that widely publicized, but he had said, look, we don't know what's in Ukraine. We don't know how much minerals are there. We don't know, do they have any minerals at all? But at least it's something. It's going to get us something back, so we're going to kind of pursue it. He sounded kind of tired at that stage. Now, remember, very senior officials had gone to Kiev and had been screamed at, apparently, by Zelensky, to the dismay of the regime there. And it culminated in this trip. The view here is one of, amazement, but not surprise. I saw a very good meme, which I posted on my X, of Donald Trump calling Vladimir Putin and saying he's completely insane. And President Putin saying, yeah, told you, kind of thing. So there's a kind of a sense here in Russia that, and we told you so, that it's very difficult to deal with this individual, that he's not a statesman. And everything that you know in the West about Volodymyr Zelensky, of course, has been manufactured. This manufactured Churchillian figure. And you and I, as people who've studied history, know that Volodymyr Zelensky, whatever you think about Churchill, I'm an Irishman, and I'd have problems with Winston Churchill, but you can't argue that the man was a giant of international politics. He loved his country, even though he may have been a very flawed individual. To sort of portray Volodymyr Zelensky as a Churchillian figure, as soon as you heard that, people should have sat up and said, there's something wrong here. The man is essentially an accelerated stooge of an oligarch, Ihor Khoiminski. And I've written this week long passages about this, particularly for the American audience, to introduce them to who this man really is. And in Russia, people are very well educated politically. They want to talk about politics. So there's been a sense of shock. There's now a sense of, well, we've told you so, but what happens next? And what's important about this, I think, from here, from this side of the pond, if you like, is how Europe is reacting, how Europe is scurrying around in this vacuum trying to portray some sort of plausibility to the war, that they're so far up this war, the pipe of this war, people like von der Leyen, such investment in political capital, in fiscal capital, in the self-harm sanctions that have destroyed and degraded the beating heart of Europe's economy, Germany, the amount of political careers that have failed as a result of this utterly foolhardy support of the war. That is how the Europeans are going to try to cobble together some sort of plausibility to continuing this war, while the Americans, this Leviathan, and we all know when America motivates itself to get behind somebody, it's very hard to defeat them. Ask the Japanese. How are they going to sort of maintain this, utterly false facade of plausibility around a war which can't be won militarily and is being essentially fronted by a grossly corrupt regime which is brutalizing its own people? That's the sense here. What happens next, particularly with an eye on Europe?
Well, let's turn to that, Chay, and see if you are any better at finding an answer than I am, for I have no answer. As you alluded to there, half the governments in Europe have fallen, in part because of their association with Zelensky. It's like a meme now, the curse of Zelensky. Everyone that's ever shaken hands with him in a chancery or a presidential office somewhere has fallen, often quite soon afterwards. Their economies have been beggared by the war, particularly the German, but all of the European governments have been gravely affected by it. There is no evidence at all that their own public opinion wants them to be doing what they were doing in London this evening. So why are they doing it? What's your guess on that?
Well, I think there's always been a sense about the war in Europe, particularly, that, as I said, so much was invested in the idea that we will stand with Ukraine forever. Nobody wants to be the first person to stand up in the room and say, the emperor has no clothes. This isn't going to work. Now, two have stood up in the room, Robert Fico and Viktor Orban, have all along said this can't be won militarily. And these are people who bear very close proximity with the war. But I think the degrees of separation in a place like London, which is, in my view, people like Johnson represent a sort of a post-colonial delusion syndrome. They see the Ukrainian crisis as an ability to exert some sort of influence, to re-establish London as a centre of geostrategic power. And they've done that very aggressively. And Starmer, as a Labour man, as an apparent socialist, has picked up the baton from Johnson very eagerly, which is in many ways repellent, in my view. But there's been so much invested in it, George, in my view. And I've written about this early in the conflict. I said that the most dangerous time is when it's utterly apparent that the war is lost militarily. It's utterly apparent that the Russians can't be defeated, that the Russian economy is actually growing, that all this think tank fantasy, this vacuous, flawed arguing about, Russia being, a fraction damaged society, that the Russian people don't support their president. These sort of tropes that are bouncing around in Whitehall and did bounce around in the White House in the Biden administration seem to only, cure and salve the individuals involved there. It's like the European Union. They love to talk to each other. They're meeting in London tonight, the European leaders. They're not talking to the Russians. Just like they meet in Davos, they meet everywhere. They're great at meeting. They're meeting on trains. They're meeting in these beautiful, luxurious places, but they don't want to talk to the Russians. The Americans, on the other hand, have very quickly established the reality, whether you agree with Donald Trump politically or not, and I said this to you on my last discussion with you, I don't really care what Trump is about once he's about peace. And I think that's really at the center of this. The word peace in Europe, in the EU, is a dirty word. It's something that has to be, which you go and stand in the corner if you dare to utter the word peace, rapprochement, or the ending of this conflict. Now, every conflict in human history ends in negotiation. It's the basic tenet of international diplomacy and war. Von Clausewitz, the greatest strategic writer, in recent history, would have said that, war is politics by another means. It's the continuation of failed political will. And the fact that people like Kaja Kallas and Ursula von der Leyen and Mark Rutte are heading up Europe's, let's say, very flawed view on this war, that it's more war or victory. It's just utterly unsustainable. And the fact that the American president, who was elected by a very large majority in the United States, is being opposed and undermined by people like Kaja Kallas, who was basically sacked as prime minister of the tiny European state of Estonia. There's more people live in Birmingham. People like Mark Rutte, who was sacked by the people of Holland, and Ursula von der Leyen, who was never elected at all, other than by a bunch of crony MEPs in Europe, and has a huge cloud of corruption hanging over vaccines, military contracts with the Bundeswehr. That these are the people that are representing the will of the people of Europe. Meanwhile, the European Union is eagerly pretending there aren't hundreds of thousands of people on the streets of Romania protesting the illegal banning of the results of an election because the wrong guy won the election, Calin Georgescu. And why are they arguing against Calin Georgescu? Because Calin Georgescu wants an end to the war, like Orban wants an end to the war, like Fico wants an end to the war. And so it's almost as if being pro-peace and pro-settlement in Ukraine is almost worse now than being a paedophile in Europe. I mean, you could be anything and get a hearing in Europe right now other than be pro-peace. And in the absence of a left-wing socialist peace movement, which would have usually resided with the Labour Party or with the Democrats in the US, there's an abject lack of that movement, which always fascinates me. This vacuum is filled by this idea, we will stand with Ukraine for 1,000 years, just like Keir Starmer, the 100-year deal with Ukraine. And these grinning smirks as they trot down the corridor after Zelensky being completely, decimated in the Oval Office. That these two men could smirk as they walk down the corridor in 10 Downing Street really demonstrates the vacuous nature of their argument.
They forced the king. They forced the king to pose with them, and maybe they didn't have to force him too much. By the way, if you were a paedophile, you'd probably get a grant from USAID to put on a pantomime or an opera. But now, if you're for peace with Russia, you're right wing. You're far right, in fact. I could show you my scars. But the puzzling thing for me, Chay, is the unanimity of it all. In your country and in mine, every party, everyone, in the Dáil, from the Trotskyites, the Sinn Féin, the Fianna Fáil, the Fine Gael, the Greens, they are all with Zelensky, every single one of them. In our parliament, Tory, Labour, Liberal Democrat, even Reform, even Farage, the Greens, even the Scottish nationalists, even the Welsh nationalists, they are all with Zelensky. I don't understand that, given how far away it is, how much blood has already been lost, how much treasure has already been spent. Why don't these people want the war now to end?
Well, something that always interested me was the idea of this international rules-based order, which is very much like the manufactured phrase, Russia's full-scale, unprovoked invasion of Ukraine. Anyone who thinks that Russia's invasion of Ukraine was unprovoked is either willfully ignorant or just stupid, because there's plenty of people outlining in great detail, as you did with Mr. Piers Morgan recently, the irrefutable facts about how this conflict arrived on our doorsteps, this phase of it. So I think that international rules-based order is enforced not really by a written set of rules, because I can't find it written down anywhere. But essentially what it means is we make the rules and we enforce the orders. Okay, so that is the rules-based order. And I also am reminded of the phrase that if voting was any threat to the permanent state and the permanent government in the UK, Ireland, or in the United States, they would have banned it years ago. So if you understand, and Dominic Cummings, not a man I'm very fond of, recently gave a very interesting talk on a podcast about how the deep state in the UK essentially has pre-decided all policy prior to the arrival of any prime minister. Vladimir Putin himself said that as soon as you become president, lots of men arrive in the room with dark suits on and red ties and start telling you what to do, but you have to stand them down, you have to chase them out. And this is why this cohesive idea, it's almost Mason-like, I believe, this idea, as you say, that political parties at such polar opposite ends of the scale will coalesce around this idea that they're defending freedom and democracy in a country which has banned elections, which has oppressed minorities, which has harassed and beaten gay people, which has terrorized a significant chunk of its own population since 2014. All history can be erased. History begins on the 24th of February 2022, when Vladimir Putin rolled out of bed in his volcano and stuck a pin in a map and decided to invade the virginal Ukraine. This is the narrative. And I think that is the narrative, not because of any sort of moral obligation to the people of Ukraine. I think it's an obligation to this unwritten Mason-like cohesion around this worlds-based order and this rules-based order, which has, of course, licensed wars in Serbia, Syria, Afghanistan, Libya, Iraq, Grenada, Panama. George, you know the list. So if you actually step back and have a look at it, this is about a Western sort of aggressive ideology around enforcing their rules-based order on people who won't sit down or kneel down when they're told to. And the biggest culprit in not kneeling down when they're told to has been for many hundreds of years, first the Russian Empire, then the Soviet Union, and now the good old Russian Federation, which has no intention of kneeling down, has actually been inoculated and strengthened by this war, socially, culturally, militarily. And in the halls of power, in Whitehall, in the Pentagon, and Brussels, they will freely admit this. I speak to people who say, look, we know the war is over, but I'm not going to be the first one to put my hand up and say the emperor has no clothes on, George.
Yeah, they used to say that at party meetings, congresses and so on, nobody wanted to be the last man, or the first man rather, to stop clapping Comrade Stalin. So they just kept on clapping until somebody dropped. But you mentioned the word inoculation there. You and I, have been effectively marginalized, and in your case, having to work outside your country in order freely to speak. If you were in Ireland, you would not be able to speak so freely. We're all in fear of the algorithm, of the suppressor, the censor, all the time. Just today, the No to NATO, No to War Twitter account was banned on Elon Musk's Twitter, even though he's in favor of the abolition of NATO. Von der Leyen has just issued an extraordinary new order, marching order. She said that we are all to be vaccinated against disinformation before we catch it, before we get it, so we won't fall victim to it. It sounds like they have a plan for yet more repression of free speech, the very repression that they denied when J.D. Vance brought it up in the Oval Office. What do you think?
Yeah, I think the new front in this conflict which has shifted now from a proxy war between the United States and the Russian Federation and China to some extent, Iran to some extent, has now definitely shifted to Europe. The EU is now being told by its big brother, you start another fight in the pub, I won't be stepping in for you this time. Okay, so now we have to watch and see, will the EU sit down, shut its mouth, or will it keep antagonizing its big neighbor? But now, it's important that people understand this, that There's no absolutely zero intelligence or plausible analysis that can tell you that the Russian Federation has any plan whatsoever, military or political, to attack NATO, whatever NATO is. NATO is Turkey. NATO is Sweden. There's no remote sentient evidence of that. Just like there's no evidence that the Soviet Union ever planned to attack NATO or Europe either. So let's get that straight. There's no evidence that Vladimir Putin ever said that the special military operation would take 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months. He never mentioned any time frame, but that's regularly peddled as well. So you have to understand that the momentum of the EU and NATO is completely and utterly shackled to the outcome of this war. I wrote about this a long time back in the conflict, just after this phase of it broke out, saying that there is NATO is essentially, remember, it's an arsonist that sells fire alarms during the day. So there must be fear of an assault. There must be a reason to fund the military-industrial complex, and there must be a reason to peddle that fear to an ignorant population. So one element of that is making sure people like you and me are, first of all, marginalized, secondly, shut down, then threatened. But the most important thing is that we are prevented from inoculating the people of our own countries from this idiotic, absorption of propaganda by osmosis. Now, remember, you sit in your car in Dublin, Glasgow, London, you put on the radio, you're going to be told, the Russians are coming. You read a newspaper, if you do so still. I don't know if anybody actually read newspapers anymore. You put on Piers Morgan, you turn on Sky News, CNN, ABC, BBC. It's just ridiculously coordinated, as was demonstrated by the tweets about supporting Ukraine unconditionally, where I think von der Leyen and 3 or 4 others tweeted the exact same thing. And if that didn't prove to you that this is a coordinated fantasy, I don't know what does. So the momentum has always been escalation. So they escalated, they pushed to bomb Moscow, they pushed to bomb Russian regions. They planned and executed, the British in particular, the Kursk incursion, which has been a catastrophic military disaster for the Ukrainian forces. 70,000 dead, hundreds and hundreds, if not over thousands of vehicles destroyed, mostly Western equipment, while the Russian army continues to encroach eastwards, day by day, village by village, town by town. It's been a complete catastrophe. So the next phase, when the Americans basically told the EU, look, you're going to have to stop bombing the Russians, there's a red line here, we don't want a war with them. What do they do next? They're going to try to replace the money that the Americans have been flushing into Ukraine. No talk about audits, no talk about national, referenda to ask the people of Europe, as you said, is this something you want to do? Because they know that the ordinary people would immediately say, we don't want this war to continue. We want it to end. We want a just peace. So the momentum has to be escalation. The momentum has to be denial. And I think at the stage where these individuals like Johnson and von der Leyen and Guy Verhofstadt and these ugly, it's really repellent, the level of their aggression and hatred and bloodthirstiness, that they have to continue, because if they fail to continue, it's like a shark. As soon as it stops swimming, it dies. And if this war in Ukraine comes to an end, which is seen as unfavorable to NATO, it's the end of NATO. It's probably the end of the EU, and it's the end of this idea of the rules-based order. Now, there's a lot of money, a lot of elites, the World Economic Forum, a lot of globalist cash money and investment in Ukraine, in the European Union, and we know that. And these people will pull the tablecloth out from under the feast before they'll get up and walk away from the table and admit they were wrong. This is not something that they do and won't do lightly. So it's either peace brokered by the United States, which looks a little shaky now, or, as Donald Trump said, I'll let you both fight it out. And if that's the case, we all know that Russia's military production is 4 times that of NATO, particularly in shell production. We all know that they just don't have the depth of manufacturing. They're talking about increasing this, increasing that. It could take 15 years. Will there be a Ukrainian state left if Russia continues its war against it in the current form? in my view, militarily and politically, it's highly unlikely. Who's going to blink first? The Russian Federation?
I'm with you. I'm with you on that. I'm with you on that, Chay. It's either peace or a continuation of the war, and a continuation of the war only has one ending, however long it takes.